All right, now let's talk about actually using prompt engineering in LLMs. So this video will be a bunch of tips and tricks and other ways to think about prompt engineering. We'll look specifically at ChatGPT, I think because that's the most commonly used one, and honestly it's the one with the most out there to reference. But it would be interesting to maybe see if some of this applies to Gemini or Llama or other tools as well. I assume some of it will, but maybe not in the exact same way that it applies to ChatGPT. So the first thing to remember about prompt engineering is it's really an iterative process, right? So when anyone wants to figure out how to write a good prompt, like the first thing they do is they go to ChatGPT and they start with what they know works. But because of the uniqueness of the latent space or the uniqueness of the content they're trying to get out of the model, they often do need to make changes, iterate on it, improve different pieces. So I will do my best in this video to sort of show an iterative process, but I'll also it doesn't always work. And this is where you can lose lots of hours to prompt engineering. And I would say like a key way to think about prompt engineering is like you're basically writing code, but like in a natural language environment, and you really are trying to work at scale, right? So if you're trying to do a prompt engineering project for like a one-off piece of text, you're gonna struggle, or you're gonna find that, hey, maybe I could have just written this instead of like generating a prompt, because to actually get a good prompt, it's going to take a little while. So with that in mind, just keep that in mind as we go through this process. And lastly, like I'll say, one of the great things about ChatGPT is its history, and therefore you can leverage that for future sessions. So make sure that you do either save or copy the prompts you find that work really well, and then maybe you can reuse them for the next version. So let me just quickly show what it looks like in how I do this in ChatGPT. So I will be going through each of these different pieces right now. The sample project I'm going to do here is basically take a UX research interview that actually had ChatGPT generate. I'll talk about that at the end of this. So I generated a fake user interview, and then we're trying to use that user interview to break apart the different questions, maybe create a summary or pull a good quote out of each one of these, apply some sentiment analysis, as well as try to tag each of these questions with different responses. So this is actually quite a meaty project, and would be something that I would do at scale, right? I would do numerous interviews over and over again, and I would then take that data, that transcript from that, and bring it into ChatGPT, and then apply my prompt to it, and therefore it could work on every single interview that I do throughout my career or whatever. So there's definitely a rationale for why I would want to spend time to improve upon this and use prompt engineering to get the best result possible. Also, it's a great experience where like you don't want any fabricated data. If you get fabricated data in a UX research prompt, like you're gonna have a lot of problems going forward, because if you're gonna highlight like, hey, you made this up, or like this isn't actually factual, how can we trust any of this data? So it's another case where you want to make sure your prompt is also reinforcing that you get the most accurate data out of it. So I've gone ahead and already made this because honestly, to do this takes a lot of time. ChatGPT's frustrating thing of like having to spell out each line one by one on a task like this is really annoying. So I went ahead and did it myself. Now, two things to know about this is when you're doing prompt engineering, I highly recommend that for every prompt, you create a new chat. So you'll see here, I have many different prompts and many different chats. And that's because every time you make a new chat, you're removing the previous context window. So basically you're eliminating the context window and starting from scratch. This is good for iteration, because if you don't do this, your previous prompt or your previous response from the model might actually influence your next prompt. And what we kind of want to do here is isolate the variables, right? We want to limit the amount of change so we can see how little details or changes in structure actually change the output of our prompt. The other thing I should say is that in many cases, I generated multiple versions of my prompt or my output. This is also good because you want to make sure that there's not like this randomization process where you're getting a good result for one thing, but you're not getting a good result frequently on every time you create the output. So just a couple of tips on how I do prompt engineering and how I make sure that understanding what I'm prompting for, understanding the structure I'm building is actually showing up the way I expect it to. So again, always start with a new chat window to remove any context from the previous session, and generate multiple versions just so you can make sure it's working the way you expect. And the slight differences in the output are really just like formatting changes or like stylistic changes maybe from ChatGPT. Okay, so with that, let's start and talk about like our prompts here. So the goal for this is going to be, we want a longer prompt. So short prompts might be how you start, using ChatGPT. You might find it really cool that you can give it like one sentence and it generates a really good prompt. But what we've actually found is that longer prompts are much better. They provide a lot more context. They give you better structure for your data, and they are often more accurate when you prompt them in the right way. So what we're going to do is we're going to build up our prompt to get to quite a lengthy prompt, in fact, but it will give us the most accurate data and give us the structure that we expect coming out of the model. So let me just show an example of this. So what I did is I took my UX research interview, which is all of this text, and all I did was copy and pasted it into the chat window, and then I just said summarize this. And if you read through the summary that was given, it actually sort of like sets the whole context for the conversation, right? So it's like discussion between the UX researcher and a user, that sort of thing. And like for me, I don't want that. I know already that it's a UX research transcript. What I actually want is what are the guts and the details of this. And this is kind of the problem of where if you are too ambiguous and just say summarize this, it's going to give you a higher level context you might not actually want. Now, maybe sometimes you do want that higher level context, in which case something like this might work. But again, I would say in the use case that I'm looking for here is it's not actually helpful. So the first tip and trick that I've seen pretty much everyone start to use, even the OpenAI folks, there are some videos online of OpenAI people training people how to use these tools. I'll add some links in the video. The first trick they use is what I would describe as assign a role. And this would be, before you start your prompt, you say you are a tax lawyer, or you are a veterinarian, or you are a criminal hacker. And this does feel like a bit of a hack, but when you think about the actual data it's been trained on, I always think about this as like, imagine that it just trained entirely on Reddit, and the worst sort of behaviors of Reddit and the best behaviors of Reddit kind of come out of here, right? So let's say someone asks a question and says like, hey, am I liable for this thing via my taxes, right? And lots of people might respond with, either bad information, incorrect information, but then someone posts on there and says, well, I'm a tax lawyer, and here's what I think your answer is. That sort of like bubbles up to the top of these models, right? So by telling them like, hey, you are this thing, they're able to sort of find the latent space where it's expertise and that knowledge queue. So I tend to find like this is the first thing you want to add is like, what is the role that you want the ChatGPT to play? So let's take a look at how that works in our output here. So what you'll see is I've changed this to you are a UX researcher assigned to summarize the following conversation between another researcher and a user. And when you do that, you'll see that it still kind of gives me a little bit of a prompt here, but I would say overall, these pieces are a little bit better structured. And especially when I get my quotes here, I get a better structure and I get a little bit more of like what I would describe as UX research language, right? It uses common terminology to help make this a little bit clearer. And I think, if I were going to share this with other UX researchers or other things, like this would be the way I would want to go. So this is a great starting place and allows you to sort of, again, set the context for the model. Another tip that I've found that works quite well is making sure that you format your inputs correctly. So as you might have noticed in this example, one of the things we're doing is we are uploading a whole text document of a research interview, but then we're also asking at the top of the page for like, some prompts, some tasks that we're asking the model to produce. And sometimes if the prompt or the task is too long or just kind of blends in with the prompt itself or the text itself, you can get a weird output. So one of the common things that you want to do is you want to make sure that you're delimiting your document that is being read, quote unquote. So this can look like, wrapping it in quotes, which is hard to do if you have quotes inside of it. Often what I tend to do is use triple backticks or use 2 asterisks. The models are kind of good. They can figure out where breaks are or where the difference in context is, but you should at least delimit it regardless. And we'll look at an example of that in just a minute. One other tip I want to also mention, which is kind of funny, is be nice to your ChatGPT. There's actually some research. It's hit or miss. It's not like the most in-depth researched idea, but shows that being courteous during a ChatGPT session actually improves the performance of your model's responses. Now, this kind of makes sense. Again, if we go back to that idea that this has been trained entirely on Reddit, If you've ever been on those forums, like people treat each other like jerks, like quite often. So, you can imagine someone asking for help and then, getting met with just a flood of people calling them stupid or whatever. And then one person steps in and actually provides a good response. And that then the original poster's response can be like, thank you so much. This was so helpful. You're so kind. So you can almost imagine that the model is learning that, like, how would I say this? Like, courteousness leads to better responses. So I think there's something really interesting there, and it's definitely something to check out. Let's take a look at both of these in action in ChatGPT. And actually, I'll show one example of actually a bad use case of this, and we'll talk a little bit why that is. So in this example, you'll see here, I said you are a UX researcher assigned to summarize a conversation between another researcher and a user. Please summarize the text in triple brackets. And here you'll see I have triple brackets. Now, when I first ran this, what I got out was this. So what's happening here? So all of a sudden I'm getting code here. That's weird. So the challenge here is that if you know how Markdown works, Markdown is a sort of pseudo like stylistic language where if you wrap stuff in triple brackets, that turns it into a code output. So what happened here is I wrote this sort of incorrectly, or I wrote it in an ambiguous way, which says, please summarize the text in triple brackets. So I was saying, please summarize this text that is in triple brackets, and it took it to say, summarize the text and make sure your output is in triple brackets. So this is one of the areas where ambiguity in language might make sense to us, but it doesn't make sense to the model. I redid this one, and instead I got this conversation. Let's see. You are a UX researcher assigned to summarize a conversation between another researcher and a user. The conversation is provided in triple backticks below. Please summarize the conversation. So again, I kind of reworded it so that it was clear that this is the text, and then what we want is a summary. And apparently there was an error regenerating this, so let's see if we can get a better one here. And sure enough, here we go. So this is our output from this. So again, I would say in this example, like the please and thank you and the inputs didn't matter that much. It does look quite similar in the way that our other examples used, but I still think it's worthwhile just sort of experimenting and seeing if in one case something works better than the other. At this point, we have kind of seen that like maybe we're hitting the walls of the limitations of this tool or the way you're prompting. Ideally, I want to start thinking about like how I really want to use this, right? I've got a bunch of block quotes here. Maybe that's helpful, but really what I want to get to is something that is more like a bunch of bullet points, right? So how do I go about doing that? And this is where intent comes into play. So let's take a look at that next. So with intent, the idea here is that we want to be very clear about what our output goals are. It seems kind of self-explanatory, but you want to think a lot about how will this be used, right? So you actually want to tell the model, how do you plan on using this? So in this case, I might say something like, I plan to use this in a research presentation or a presentation to my leadership team, or I want to upload this to a database or that sort of thing. If you want a creative output, you want to tell the model like, hey, I want something creative. I want imaginative ideas, those sort of things. And if you're expecting a certain format, you also want to ask for that. As we saw before, the triple backticks do create code. If I want that, I can even tell the model like, hey, show me a code output, that sort of thing. And we'll cover format in just a minute, a little bit more. Alongside intent is also, I think, this concept of clarity, and these kind of go hand in hand. But for clarity, this is a great example. I saw this the other day where someone was saying, oh, I'm designing a slide deck and I want an image for a presentation. I ask for a picture of a grieving wife at a cemetery. And of course, they get a very weird image, right? They get a wife with, I don't know, half a woman in a casket. And here's the thing is like, you kind of asked for that. You left it as ambiguous as possible. And you need to imagine that you're talking to like the dumbest, most petulant toddler ever. And if you ever talk to toddlers, you know that they will like turn every little thing against you. And that's kind of what's happening here, right? So if you wanted a better image, it would be, you know, a wife at a cemetery leaving flowers at a gravestone, right? That would eliminate, you know, this casket thing. But again, like these models do what you ask of them, but if you don't give them any more detail than that, you're going to end up with weird stuff like this. So again, the way I approach this is like the who, what, when, where, why, and how. This should always be, you know, what's the purpose of me doing this? When do I need it by? I don't really need that, so it's going to be immediate. Maybe the why or like the how or like, you know, who is it for? I think adding these details where possible is going to give you a much better return on responses. So let's take a look at this in ChatGPT. So here you'll see I've added literally, I think, maybe 2 or 3 more sentences. So you're a UX researcher assigned to summarize a conversation between another researcher and a user. The goal of this summary is to find the key insights from this interview. This summary will be shared with leaders within the company as a presentation, and then literally just please summarize. Now, just these 2 sentences, look what happened to my response. My response is now written out almost like, a paper that you would hand off to a leader, right? This is sort of the one-pager of what's important here. So just by giving a little bit more clarity around like what my goals are, I immediately get something that's structured a little bit better. You'll see here it now has the interview overview, the key insights, and a conclusion. Again, really great. And all we had to do was add 2 sentences here. So let's actually edit this. I'm going to create a new one. I want to see if there's also another thing we can do here, which is I'll paste this in. And let's say I want to find the 5 key insights. Now, these models are not the best when it comes to counting. That has to do with the way these token systems work. But we can actually put this in, and let's see if we get 5 back. Now, see here I get a slightly different output as well. It isn't the sort of nice sort of structure of the beginning, the key insights, or the overview, the key insights, and then the conclusion. It looks like instead I'm just going to get the insights. Now, if I rerun this multiple times, maybe I would get more insights, or maybe I would get a better structure. But this is kind of what you take and get with these things. And we'll look a little bit how to get a better format, or how to be a little bit more clear about our format in just a minute. So it looks like both these finished, and sure enough, I do in fact get just 5 key elements per piece. Now this one has an intro, and it looks like they both have an outro. So again, this is where if I wanted to also reinforce from the model, I like this one, and that would be what I get. All right, another quick tip is looking at something like tone. Kind of funny thing here, actually, if you ever make a custom GPT, which is a custom model, using ChatGPT's interface, one of the first things it asks you for is tone. It says, do you want this to be professional? Do you want this to be friendly? Do you want it to be funny? And I kind of held this off, I guess, maybe a little bit too late, but like this is a thing you should also encourage putting into your prompt as soon as possible. So in this case, it is, again, it's friendly, professional, it's short and to the point, it's insightful, it's poetic. Like this is where you can start to play with style a little bit more. In this case, with my example, like, I don't know, maybe there isn't a lot to say here, but if I look at tone, what I can put in is something like, the tone should be friendly but professional, providing short but insightful, and that's not really the way to put that, but insightful, I don't know, keys, or I don't know, insightful something, let's say. You'll see that even though this is not good English, the model kind of figured out what I meant. So if we scroll and look at the response, you'll see again, it's maybe a little shorter. It looks like some of this is broken down into smaller pieces. We can double check to see if that's true of all these. This one's a little bit more better, like sort of structured. With this one, the tone might not be super important, but let's say you're trying to do something that is more creative and you want to add like a poetic flair to it, like you would include that in to get something else out of this. In this case, I'm going for something like straight bare bones, kind of meat and potatoes. So I think it already captured the tone by some other prompts I had going on. All right, this one, if there's any of them that you're going to take directly from me and try to implement, it would be this one, which is around structure. The key to this one is that you really want to provide as much detail as possible, and you often want to even provide the format and the structure that you expect back from the model. In this case, if you can set up the format, you will always get back at least what you want in terms of structure. You might not get back the exact content you want, or the answers that it gives you might be incorrect, but at least in this way you can begin to structure your content, and then you can work on the little details or like the fabrications and try to fix those. So let's take a look at this. I've got a couple examples here in ChatGPT. So the first thing I almost always do is just give it a little bit of a description. So one thing you can do is you can sort of set up the initial part here, and then at the end you can add sort of like, hey, at the end I want you to make sure you do this, right? So in this case, I'm saying, hey, at the very end, provide an overall sentiment from the user in regards to their experience. And if we scroll down here, you'll see, again, I've got our structure, which we got from the previous example. And then now I also get an overall sentiment. And this gives me a little bit of another section to look at. Now, we can go even further than this because all we've really done here is take the default structure we got from that intent and clarity section, and then we added this. We can go even further, and we can start to say, hey, here's the exact format I want. So usually what I'll see people do is they'll put it in some sort of delimited item here. So I'll say ** format. And then in here, I list literally everything I want in the order I want it, right? So question, that's the first thing I want. So tell me the question the researcher asked. Second, summary. Provide a one-sentence summary of the user's response. And then I want a quote that supports that summary. And then I want you to do sentiment analysis. So basically tell me if this summary or this user's response is positive, neutral, or negative. Now you'll see here I'm saying you must use these. This is really important because if you delete this, you might just get back, a bunch of text that is sentiment. But in this case, I want only positive, neutral, or negative. And then at this point, I also want to ask for tags. So I want to say, can you tag this part of the conversation as one of these tags? And then lastly, I also add in this thing of give me the sentiment for each question at the very end. So this structure is really important because this is going to give you back everything exactly in the order you want. And then lastly, you'll see I slightly changed our output here to include text to summarize. And then after that, I've got that. And if we look at what I actually get back from this model, we get sort of a headline. And then again, we get every one of these is itemized. So we get a question, we get a summary, we get a quote, we get a sentiment, and we get tags. Now, when I actually go through and look at these tags, I don't think they're particularly accurate. It seems to be applying it to just about all of them. This one's okay. So it's doing a so-so job. And this is where, now that I've got the structure I want, I might go in and actually begin to prompt engineer just the tag section. And I think that's what I do in this one. Let's see. Yeah, so here, I'll also ask for a sentiment quote. I want to see if there was a sentiment that could, or a quote that could match up with a sentiment. And then here I go into even more prompt engineering with the tags themselves. Now, one thing I'll note here is I'm starting to get a very long response because I'm asking for each one of these per research question. And when I did run these, it would stop after, I don't know, maybe question 8 or 9. And then there was a little button here that would say continue prompt or continue generation. And I have to click that to get the rest of it filled out. But now you'll see here, I do have, this is really structured nicely for me. And again, overall sentiment, and it still gives me the feedback here, or a little description. But I kind of like this. We're now getting a bunch of basically rich data. And the model is able to do this without ever looking at any examples. This is what we call zero-shot learning or few-shot. Actually, pretty much zero because I've never seen anything like this before. At least I'm not prompting it to do that. So it's able to guess, based on how the user feels from this, what the sentiment is, right? So in this case, it's saying, it's often emphasizing too much of the vampire aspect, and that's a negative. And they're finding a quote that says exactly that too. It's a bit frustrating, right? So we're seeing, this is being overemphasized too much, and that's frustrating. And then it's also providing our tag system. This is great, but I want to show you one last trick here, which is that you can also ask for this particular format in a different output format. So let's say I want to take all this learning and then I want to stick it in our research database. And our research database has particular clips or different pieces of content that we have to upload directly. So in this case, I can come over here, and what I'm now asking for is, finally, please provide the research question outputs in a JSON format. The keys used should be question, summary, quote, sentiment, and tags. JSON is a really great format, and I find that ChatGPT 4 especially does a really good job of writing to JSON. The one thing I found is that you have to be pretty clear about the keys being used, and you have to be pretty clear about the order in which they happen, as well as some other things around child and parent and that sort of thing. But in this case, it did output everything correctly for me, right? So you'll see I've got an array here, and inside each array is the question, the summary, the quote, the sentiment, and the tags associated with it. And I get that for all 12 questions. Now, this is really, really helpful. This is something I could now use and put into a database very easily. And this is a common behavior that we see engineers utilize ChatGPT for. So obviously there's this interface here where you can get stuff out of ChatGPT directly, but there's also an API, and this is where an engineer might write to the API and always ask back for it formatted like this, so it can then go in and parse out all of the data and stick that in a database or use it in its own way. So really cool, and this is where, again, this formatting section becomes really, really helpful, especially for more complicated tasks. So there's just a ton you can do here, and the only thing to watch out for is that you don't get too long of a response. For me, I did find out that ChatGPT would regenerate or generate the second part of the response fairly easily, but I can imagine if you've got a really, really long transcript that it might struggle with that. You might need to break that up into pieces. All right, one last tip is to reduce complexity. So often I will see people try to solve a really big sort of piece of text and try to have a solution for it made in like one step. And generally that doesn't work that well because these models, like humans, jump to conclusions, meaning they might pick up certain words in the overall text and just use that as their answer. So the key here is to really break large tasks into small tasks, especially when you're asking for maybe the sum output of some text. So again, remember that in our example, we're looking at something like a summary of the UX research. And if I were to ask just sort of like an initial, hey, what's the sentiment of this overall like 500 word interview? It might pick up on a couple words and say, well, like overall this interview is negative. Instead, what I did here, if we look at this example, is, based on the overall sentiment, so basically like we're asking for each individual sentiment, and then we're going and we're saying based on all of those, do we think this is positive, neutral, or negative? And by breaking it down into individual pieces, it can actually maybe sort of, I don't want to say it tabulates, but it can actually look at those as individual pieces and then add up. This isn't maybe the best example. I've seen this used in better examples for like checking math homework or something, where you might ask the model to actually go and do the math itself and then compare that math to the entry that someone uploaded. And by doing the math itself and then comparing those two separately, then you get a real answer. Whereas instead, if you asked, hey, is this answer correct? It's not going to actually do the math itself. It's just going to look at it and be like, yep, that looks right. Okay, go ahead. So this again, this is maybe not the best example, but other examples would be like just really think about breaking this product down into individual pieces, and then use the format or use the steps to have the prompt system, the model, do the actual work one by one, and then have it finalize based on that final output. All right, so that's it for sort of like overall prompt tips and tricks. I have one last thing for you. I mentioned that at the beginning of this recording that I had like ChatGPT write the entire research scenario and research interview out for me. And the way I did that was using this thing. So I got this right off of Reddit. So it's not really that impressive of my work. It's someone else's. And we're going to have ChatGPT actually write our prompt for us. So let's actually try this with the example we're using, and let's see how this works. So essentially, I'll go over here to this Reddit piece, and I will copy and paste this whole piece of text. And I'm going to copy and paste this into a new ChatGPT chat. So what is this doing? It's basically asking me a series of questions to help improve the overall prompt that it's going to create for me. So we'll start by just hitting enter. And then what should our prompt be about? I want a summary of a UX research interview I provide. Now you'll see here, you can kind of learn from this almost in reverse order, which is my communication style is concise and straightforward, focusing on clear, actionable insights. Here's an example of how I typically communicate. So it provides this, and then it provides a critique of the overall prompt, and then it asks a couple additional questions. How will the interview content be provided to ChatGPT? Typed out, summarized by you, or uploaded as a document? That's a good question. Let's do typed out. For 2, do you have a specific length in mind for the summary? maximum number of words or paragraphs. Let's say no more than 5 key takeaways. Number 3, are there specific aspects of the UX research, such as usability, accessibility, user satisfaction, that you want the summary to focus on or prioritize? Let's say usability. We'll hit return. And now it's rewriting our prompt for us. And it even provides a couple examples. Then it provides a critique of that example. And then it's going to ask us a couple of additional questions. So do I want general impressions from the interview or strictly stick to specific feedback? Let's say stick to specific feedback. Are brief direct quotes from participants desired in the interview, desired in the summary to illustrate points, or should they be focused on on paraphrasing their feedback? Direct quotes are important and desired. And then for 3, is there an interest in identifying any indirect factors mentioned in the interview that could affect usability, e.g. performance issues or accessibility concerns? Let's say no. So let's have it write this one more time for us. Now I could go through this again and again, but instead what I'm going to do is actually just take this prompt and we're going to work with it. So you'll see it asks for, are there any specific formatting requirements? Is there a preference for the summary to be structured in a specific order? Considering the emphasis on direct quotes, would you like brief interpretation or recommendation following each quote? So again, we can almost see that it's actually doing a lot of our work for us. So if you learn nothing from this video, I guess take this prompt and answer 3 or 4 rounds of this questions, and then we'll see where we get. So let's go ahead and create a new one, and we'll paste this in, and then we'll say text to summarize. Let me grab our text here again, paste that in, and hit return. You'll see this gives me a different structure than I previously had before, but it did ask me some questions that I hadn't really considered yet. So I could take those considerations and actually move that into my previous prompt where I had all my formatting laid out, I had the specific instructions, that sort of thing. So again, you can also combine these ideas and concepts together in a way that I think is really, really interesting. So that's how to use ChatGPT to create a prompt for itself. I don't know, kind of like an Ouroboros of prompting. Anyway, that was the entire video for prompt engineering. I know there was a lot, but I hope you found some steps that were really helpful. In future sessions, we'll be looking for something very similar, but just for image generation. So until next time, thanks again for watching, and I hope this is helpful.